Martin Caldwell adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time that evening, though in reality it had been only a few nervous minutes. The room shimmered with soft lighting, glass chandeliers casting warm reflections over the gathered colleagues, friends, and family who had come to celebrate the culmination of 40 years of meticulous work. He smiled politely at familiar faces, nodding and shaking hands, yet a weight pressed on his chest, one he couldn't quite place. There was an unfamiliar tension beneath the polite laughter and clinking of glasses, a quiet undertone that he had sensed for weeks, but had hoped was simply paranoia. Tonight was supposed to be a culmination of pride, not suspicion. Martin had devoted his entire adult life to the corporate world, climbing ranks and negotiating deals with sharp precision. And yet, as he looked at the faces around him, there lingered a gnawing feeling of uncertainty. Celeste, his wife of 36 years, glided into the room with her usual polished grace, but Martin noticed a subtle stiffness in her posture. She greeted their guests with practiced charm, yet when their eyes met across the room, there was a coldness there he hadn't seen in years, a detachment that made his stomach twist. The children, Adrian and Lila, mingled with peers and colleagues, offering polite smiles and feigned enthusiasm. Martin caught Adrian's glance, and something in that look made him uneasy. It wasn't simple teenage awkwardness. There was calculation there, a careful weighing of expectations and rewards. Lila's laughter, too loud and forced, clashed with the soft jazz playing in the background, making him wince. He had always prided himself on being perceptive, but this was something else. As the speeches began, colleagues praised Martin for his decades of service, highlighting his financial acumen and the mentorship he had offered countless young professionals. Applause filled the room, but Martin felt a hollow echo in his chest. When it was time for Celeste to step forward, she held a small envelope delicately in her hand. Martin assumed it was a card, a sentimental note expressing pride and affection. Her eyes, however, met him with a sharp intensity that made his heart skip. The room quieted as she addressed him, her voice smooth yet eerily detached. "Martin," she began, "we've shared many years together, and you've given so much. But it's time for a new chapter." She handed him the envelope with a deliberate motion, and the weight of her words hit him before he even opened it. Inside were divorce papers, crisp and formal, the legal language precise and unyielding. The room seemed to blur at the edges, the applause from a colleague's speech fading into nothing. He felt the air thicken around him, each breath heavy with disbelief. Martin looked up at Celeste, searching for any hint of jest, any sign that this was some twisted party prank, but found only a steely determination. Adrian stepped forward next, awkwardly clutching a folder of papers. "Dad," he said, voice shaking slightly, we think this is best. Mom's right. It's time to move on." Lila nodded, her eyes avoiding his. "We just want everyone to be happy," she murmured. Martin's heart contracted painfully, the realization crashing over him. Not only had his wife betrayed him, but his own children, those he had loved and guided for decades, had chosen money and convenience over loyalty. For a moment, Martin felt the world tilt beneath him, a strange vertigo that made his vision swim. He had imagined conflict with employees, perhaps even colleagues questioning decisions, but never this. Never his family. He could hear the subtle whispers at the edges of the room, the stunned murmurs of friends who hadn't known, hadn't guessed. Faces he had trusted seemed to dissolve into shallow expressions, polite sympathy tinged with confusion and judgment. He forced himself to breathe, to steady his voice, but even as he lifted a hand to speak, his mind was racing. How did it come to this? The nights of sleepless planning, the birthdays and holidays spent together. The sacrifices, had they all been nothing but a transaction in the minds of those closest to him? Celeste's lips pressed into a faint, victorious smile as she continued. "I know this may seem sudden, Martin, but we've discussed it. Adrian and Lila understand. They know what's at stake." The words cut deeper than any professional critique, sharper than any hostile boardroom confrontation. Martin's mind drifted briefly to the life they had built, the suburban home with the oak staircase, the summer trips to the lake, the quiet evenings reading in front of the fireplace. All of it, apparently, valued only for its material worth. The irony was bitter. He had believed in the sanctity of family, in the trust and care that tied them together. Yet here he stood, unmoored in his own life, a spectator to their mercenary ambitions. He looked around the room, his colleagues' faces reflecting polite concern, some of them exchanging uncertain glances, unsure how to intervene without overstepping. Martin realized in that instant that this event, meant to celebrate his decades of dedication, had become a theater of betrayal. A laugh escaped him, soft and bitter, more to steady himself than to express amusement. "Well," he said, voice calm but tinged with disbelief, "I suppose surprises do come in every form." Celeste's eyes flicked with irritation at the casualness of his tone, yet she remained silent, her control unwavering. Martin folded the papers neatly, a deliberate motion that masked the storm roiling within him. Adrian and Lila lingered, uncertain now, sensing a shift in his demeanor. They had expected tears, perhaps anger, maybe even a desperate plea, but instead, Martin exuded a quiet, unsettling composure. There was hurt in his gaze, certainly, but also a steeliness, a hint that he had anticipated complications, that he had strategies unseen. Martin's lips curved in a faint smile, almost imperceptible, as though he were letting them know that this performance, this betrayal, would not define him. He rose, adjusting his suit, and addressed the gathered crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a long journey, and I appreciate every one of you who has shared it with me." His voice carried warmth toward colleagues while keeping personal grief private. As the party resumed around him, Martin felt an odd sense of detachment, as if he were observing his life from outside, watching the betrayal unfold without allowing it to shatter him completely. Celeste and the children were present, yet an invisible line had been drawn, one they had crossed without realizing the consequences. For all their schemes, for all their assumptions of entitlement, Martin knew he still held the unseen cards. The calmness in his demeanor belied the storm of plans already forming in his mind, plans not born of revenge, but of survival, self-preservation, and eventual renewal. That night, as champagne flowed and laughter filled the corners of the room, Martin quietly acknowledged the painful truth. The family he had known no longer existed. In its place stood people who valued wealth over love, convenience over loyalty. And yet, in that acknowledgement, he discovered an ember of liberation, the first spark of a life he could now claim entirely for himself, unbound by the expectations or betrayals of others. Martin Caldwell left Chicago quietly, without fanfare, slipping past the familiar streets of the city he had called home for decades. He had packed only what was necessary, leaving behind the mansion, the luxury cars, and the tangible reminders of a life that had been measured in appearances rather than loyalty. The divorce finalized swiftly. Celeste received the house and half of the visible joint accounts. Adrian and Lila were given stocks in his former company that he had already planned would depreciate. The law had been satisfied, the paperwork completed, yet Martin knew the true security of his wealth rested elsewhere, in ventures and offshore accounts carefully cultivated over years of meticulous planning. It was a quiet victory, unseen and uncelebrated, yet immensely satisfying. The betrayal had not broken him. Instead, it had clarified what mattered: freedom, control, and a chance to reclaim his life on his own terms. He drove for hours, leaving behind the glass towers and bustling streets of Chicago, the memories of family dinners, arguments over trivial matters, and celebrations of milestones fading with each passing mile. The countryside of Oregon unfolded before him, rolling hills and thick forests offering a stark contrast to the rigid structures he had left behind. Martin chose a secluded cabin, modest yet sufficient, surrounded by towering pines and the gentle sounds of nature. Here, the distractions of wealth and the constant demands of others were absent. The quiet allowed him to focus on himself, on rebuilding both body and mind, and on regaining the sense of autonomy that had been stripped away by betrayal. He felt a strange sense of exhilaration and solitude, a feeling he had not known for decades. Freedom, he realized, was sweeter than the applause and admiration of colleagues. His mornings began with the sun filtering through the cabin windows, painting the wooden floors in golden light. Martin took to long runs through the forest trails, the rhythm of his footsteps syncing with the cadence of his breathing, each stride clearing his mind, and strengthening his body. Meals became deliberate rituals. He experimented with fresh, wholesome ingredients, finding joy in the simplicity of nourishing himself. The mirrors, once a source of casual vanity, now reflected not just a man in his 60s, but a man rediscovering strength and resilience. The hours that had previously been consumed by office meetings and social obligations were now his own, filled with self-reflection, reading, and the deliberate honing of skills he had neglected. The mental acuity that had made him a successful CFO became a tool for crafting new investments, studying markets, and identifying opportunities unseen by the average investor. Using the knowledge he had amassed over decades, Martin began day trading and exploring diversified investment opportunities. He analyzed trends, assessed risk, and executed strategies with precision. Each calculated move brought small victories, the subtle growth of capital reinforcing his confidence. Within months, his wealth, hidden from those who had assumed he was leaving it all behind, began to multiply. Offshore accounts, venture investments, and discrete stock options created a financial buffer that insulated him from the chaos of the past. More importantly, Martin discovered the thrill of challenge, the intellectual satisfaction of mastering a domain where his own decisions, untouched by the expectations or betrayals of others, directly determined outcomes. It was a rebirth, both financial and personal, allowing him to reclaim the agency he had once taken for granted. Amid the rebuilding of wealth, Martin's emotional life slowly reawakened. He allowed himself to remember the joy of connection, of companionship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or financial convenience. It was in a small coastal town, while attending a community art exhibit, that he met Eleanor, a woman whose warmth and intelligence resonated with the quiet dignity he had cultivated in Oregon. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter, shared observations, and the occasional gentle teasing about the absurdities of life. Eleanor's presence reminded him that trust could be rebuilt, that love did not have to come with strings of expectation or manipulation. Gradually, they formed a partnership founded on authenticity, humor, and genuine care, a stark contrast to the calculated relationships he had left behind in Chicago. The bond with Eleanor deepened naturally, marked by patience and understanding. Together, they adopted a young girl, Maya, whose presence brought unspoken joy and purpose to their lives. Martin found himself engaged in a family dynamic rooted not in inheritance or obligation, but in love, attention, and shared growth. He watched Maya learn, struggle, and triumph, and felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with wealth or status. His health continued to improve alongside his emotional life. He became leaner, more agile, and more energetic than he had been in decades. In this serene environment, surrounded by nature and nurtured relationships, Martin cultivated a holistic sense of fulfillment. The betrayal that had once threatened to shatter him became the catalyst for a life he could never have imagined within the confines of his old existence. Despite his success and newfound happiness, Martin maintained a disciplined awareness of his past. He did not dwell on anger or resentment, but he did not forget either. The lessons of betrayal, greed, and misplaced loyalty were etched into his memory, guiding his decisions and interactions. He engaged with his financial ventures methodically, constantly evaluating and adjusting strategies, and allowed himself to experience the simple joys of reading by a fire, hiking the trails, and sharing quiet dinners with Eleanor and Maya. Each day was a reaffirmation that life could be rebuilt, that betrayal, though painful, was not the end. The man who had been discarded by family and taken for granted by his wife had reemerged as someone more powerful, self-aware, and emotionally fulfilled than ever before. In the evenings, Martin often reflected on the contrast between his old life and his present one. Chicago, with its skyscrapers, accolades, and carefully curated appearances, now felt distant, almost like a story he had once read but not fully lived. The betrayal at his retirement party, which had once seemed like an insurmountable blow, was now the turning point that had set him on this path. He realized that true family was defined not by proximity, shared blood, or wealth, but by love, loyalty, and shared values. Eleanor and Maya represented these ideals in their purest forms, reminding him daily that happiness could be cultivated deliberately, with intention and patience. He no longer feared solitude or the judgment of others. Instead, he embraced each moment as an opportunity for growth and connection. Martin's life in Oregon became a testament to resilience, strategy, and emotional reclamation. The quiet disappearance, initially motivated by necessity, evolved into a deliberate choice to cultivate a life of authenticity. He had transformed adversity into empowerment, betrayal into clarity, and loss into profound personal and financial growth. In the midst of forests and streams, he discovered the beauty of simplicity, the richness of genuine connection, and the satisfaction of self-determination. For the first time in decades, Martin Caldwell felt a complete sense of ownership over his life, not the life others wanted for him, but the one he had deliberately built from the ground up. The quiet disappearance was no longer a retreat. It was the foundation of a thriving, fulfilled existence. Years passed, and the distance between Martin Caldwell and his former life grew not just in miles, but in experience, wisdom, and the quiet satisfaction of genuine happiness. Chicago remained a city of memories for him, but those memories carried little weight beyond lessons learned. He had cultivated a life of balance, financial independence, and emotional fulfillment in Oregon, yet he remained aware of the ripple effects of his departure. News filtered slowly through acquaintances, snippets of misfortune that reached his ears indirectly. Celeste's ill-fated investments, Adrian's struggling business, Lila's boutique closing down, their reliance on networks and support that no longer had stability. Martin felt only a measured pang of recognition, not joy in their misfortune, but a calm acknowledgement that choices carried consequences, a lesson he had long since internalized. It was a crisp spring morning when a letter arrived, addressed in Celeste's familiar, precise hand. The envelope bore traces of haste and desperation, a stark contrast to the composed divorce papers she had once delivered. She wrote of losses, of failing ventures, of regret, and of a yearning to reconnect. Adrian and Lila had joined her plea, their words tinged with guilt and fear, seeking assistance, guidance, and forgiveness. Martin read carefully, his fingers tracing the familiar script, yet he felt no impulse to return. The people who had once chosen wealth over loyalty were now left with little else, and while part of him understood human frailty, another part recognized that he had already paid his dues in patience, disappointment, and self-restraint. He placed the letters aside with deliberate care, the decision already made in his mind. Rather than responding with the familiar generosity they expected, Martin chose to convey a message that would be both clear and indelible. He arranged for a photograph to be sent. Eleanor, smiling brightly, holding Maya in her arms, the cabin's warm lights spilling across their faces, a modest but elegant home in the background, and the glimmer of a property Martin had invested in quietly, now fully developed into a personal retreat. Along with the photo, he sent a short note, carefully composed, "The man you knew no longer exists. This life is mine, built on choices, love, and loyalty. The consequences of your actions are yours to bear. I wish you clarity and growth." It was concise, unflinching, and finally a reminder that reconciliation could not be bought with wealth or demanded through desperation. The reactions in Chicago were immediate and intense, though filtered through intermediaries and phone calls. Celeste's voice, usually crisp and commanding, faltered when she realized that her former husband had moved beyond both anger and expectation. Adrian and Lila, once confident in their presumed entitlement, faced the stark reality that Martin had not only replaced what they had taken for granted, but had done so in a way that affirmed self-reliance, personal growth, and emotional resilience. There were pleas for meetings, attempts at negotiation, offers of apologies paired with financial promises, but Martin remained steadfast. He understood that their approach was transactional, that their remorse was still entwined with material considerations, and he refused to participate in a cycle that had once caused profound pain. He had learned that true closure came from detachment, not engagement, and that some bridges, once burned, should remain as guides for reflection rather than passages to the past. In Oregon, life moved forward with serene consistency. Martin and Eleanor's partnership deepened, grounded in mutual respect and shared aspirations. Maya thrived, a vibrant presence in their home, her laughter echoing through the wooden halls and open spaces that had become a sanctuary of warmth and stability. Martin's financial endeavors flourished, each carefully considered investment a testament to foresight, patience, and disciplined risk management. He spent mornings hiking forest trails with Eleanor, afternoons reviewing markets and exploring new ventures, and evenings immersed in quiet family dinners, storytelling, and shared reflection. Each day was an affirmation of the life he had reclaimed, authentic, deliberate, and joyfully independent. Even with the deliberate distance he had maintained from his past, Martin's thoughts occasionally drifted toward the people he had once loved. It was not bitterness that accompanied these reflections, but clarity. He remembered conversations with Adrian and Lila in the kitchen, family trips to tea, which had been overshadowed by misaligned values and misplaced expectations. He understood now that their actions were not merely betrayals, but reflections of their own immaturity, their inability to recognize the depth of loyalty and love he had offered. Celeste, too, had been constrained by patterns of self-interest, blind to the relational wealth that could never be codified in legal papers or stock holdings. In these reflections, Martin found compassion without engagement, empathy without compromise, a rare equilibrium that allowed him to maintain his dignity while witnessing their downfall from a distance. Months later, Martin received another communication, this time indirectly through a mutual acquaintance who had business dealings in Oregon. The messages conveyed desperation, an acknowledgement of loss, and the hope for reconciliation, not just financial, but emotional. Adrian's business was failing, Lila's boutique shuttered, and Celeste faced ruin after a con artist exploited her naivete. They asked for guidance, support, and perhaps a chance to repair what had been broken. Martin reviewed the situation with measured attention, the years of solitude, discipline, and personal growth sharpening his perspective. He considered the human tendency to cling to comfort, to seek rescue when faced with failure, and he recognized that their requests were a reflection not of genuine contrition, but of dependency. The decision crystallized in his mind. He would not intervene. Instead, Martin sent a final message, concise and unmistakable, accompanied by the photograph of his new life with Eleanor and Maya. He did not offer financial assistance, advice, or consolation. He offered only clarity and closure. The note reinforced the principle that choices have consequences, that loyalty and love cannot be coerced, and that personal growth is earned through responsibility rather than expectation. In Chicago, the impact was immediate. Celeste, Adrian, and Lila confronted the reality that Martin had moved on entirely, that he was not merely absent but fully and intentionally engaged in a life they could no longer influence or control. Their regret, tinged with humiliation and frustration, became a mirror reflecting the values they had forsaken. Martin's response was not cruel. It was liberating for him and, in a sense, for them. By refusing to re-engage, he allowed them to face the outcomes of their choices authentically, to confront the hollowness of relationships built on convenience rather than trust. Meanwhile, he continued his life with Eleanor and Maya, nurturing the bonds of a family founded on mutual care, shared values, and deliberate attention. Each day brought growth, laughter, and a quiet contentment that contrasted sharply with the chaos and regret unfolding in Chicago. Martin had redefined family, wealth, and happiness on his own terms, discovering that the most enduring treasures are not material but emotional, relational, and cultivated with intention. The final message, the photograph, and the enduring silence became the punctuation of a chapter that could never be rewritten. Martin had moved beyond grief, betrayal, and expectation, replacing them with resilience, autonomy, and profound fulfillment. He understood that the past had shaped him, but it did not define him. The man who had once been discarded had become someone unrecognizable to those who had betrayed him, but entirely himself, strong, wise, and happy. In the quiet of Oregon, surrounded by nature, love, and self-earned prosperity, Martin Caldwell had discovered the life he had been denied in Chicago, proving that true happiness is a creation of courage, discipline, and the unwavering pursuit of one's own values. Moral lesson: True happiness is not measured by wealth, inheritance, or appearances, but by love, loyalty, and integrity. Life's betrayals can feel devastating, yet they often illuminate hidden strength and resilience. Choosing oneself, cultivating authentic relationships, and practicing patience and discipline can transform loss into empowerment. Those who value genuine connection over material gain experience lasting fulfillment, while misguided choices carry consequences. Every setback is an opportunity to rebuild wiser, stronger, and more compassionate. Embrace challenges, nurture trust, and invest in love and loyalty. In doing so, life rewards with joy that no betrayal or misfortune can ever take away.